Hello, everyone. I'm Theodor Neno, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by one of the most famous philosophers and public intellectuals, Professor A.C. Grayling. Professor Grayling is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, the Master of New College of the Humanities, and a Supernumerary Fellow of St. Anne's College, University of Oxford. Professor Grayling, it's an honor to be joined by you today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Can you please tell us a bit more about your philosophical journey? So when did you get into philosophy and what got you interested in it? And how did you decide to become a scholar?
Well, I got interested very early, but by a sort of lucky accident, which is that I spent the first part of my childhood, really, and teens in Africa. My father was working in what is now Zambia and Malawi. And so I was brought up there as a kid. And there wasn't very much to do. There was no television, and you couldn't go for country walks, because if you did, you got eaten by lions and so on. So I read a lot. And we had a set of encyclopedia at home, which I was very fond of, and I would page through it and look at all the wonderful stuff in it. I came across these photographs of these magnificent bearded gentlemen, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates with his snub nose. And I wanted to find out more about them. So I tried to understand the articles in the encyclopedia, but eventually I really wanted to see if I could find original texts and read something of what they had written to see if I could make sense of it. And when I was 12, I got a ticket for the adult section of the library, the grown-up part of the library in this little town where I lived. And lo and behold, there was a copy, complete, translations of Plato by Benjamin Jowett. And I took down the first volume and I opened it at the dialogue called The Comedies and read it. And of course, it's very accessible. It's an early dialogue by Plato, so anybody can understand it. I read it and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I thought, if these great iconic figures of our civilization dedicated their lives to this, then I'm going to do likewise. And of course, I quite soon found, because I managed to get hold of, as a teenager, I got hold of G.H. Lewis's History of Philosophy and Bertrand Russell's History of Philosophy and some stuff by John Stuart Mill and so on. Reading all this stuff made me realize that philosophy is a kind of license to stick your nose into everything and be interested in everything, science and history and society and politics, as well as the core subjects of philosophy. So it has been a kind of dream to be able to be involved in that all my life.
Yeah, you're right, because philosophy really allows you to dip into everything. For every X, whether X is mathematics, mind, science, there is a philosophy of X, and you can venture into that. And as I said, you wrote countless books, but I guess your first substantial work was your doctoral thesis at Oxford. What problem did you tackle in your doctoral dissertation?
Well, it's a problem that I became interested in very early, even before I went to university. And this was the problem of knowledge, really, about skepticism and knowledge claims. And so when I was an undergraduate and I read Berkeley, I misunderstood Berkeley to begin with, and in a rather dramatic way, because I thought he was right that the world doesn't exist other than in mind. And so, for about 5 very, very bad seconds, I was a subjective idealist. And then I realized that there was something very wrong with that argument. And so I wanted to know about it. And one of my early books, in fact, is an extended study of Berkeley. But before I got around to that, I really wanted to try to address this question of how we deal with skeptical challenges to knowledge claims in the empirical realm, so based on our perceptual experience. And I was taught at Oxford by P.F. Strawson and A.J. Ayer, Freddie Ayer. They were my supervisors. And of course, Freddie Ayer had written quite a lot on this subject too. And Strawson had an approach to these things that I very much liked, because I found myself persuaded by the principle, if not the actual detail, but certainly by the principle of the Kantian approach, namely that we have a set of framework of concepts that we bring to the interpretation of data, of input from our environment, and that if we were able to construct an argument that shows that these contributions are transcendentally necessary, then we will be able to rebut the skeptic. So I wrote on that in my DPhil thesis. By the way, while I was writing my DPhil thesis, I felt the need for a book which would really, with great clarity, explain all the fundamental concepts that we really need to have to hand when we're doing philosophy. So concepts of truth, concepts of necessity and analyticity, the a priori, identity, all those sorts of problems. And there just wasn't one. So I put my DPhil aside and I wrote that book, which is the Introduction to Philosophical Logic, in order to really clear my mind about all those topics and to have available the arguments and the literature that was relevant. Then I went back to the DPhil, finished it, and then published part of the DPhil as my first book on skepticism. So I've written several things on skepticism. And in fact, I'm now writing yet another one because my thinking about it has developed over time. And I've come to realize, as you will see when we get to the Frontiers of Knowledge book, that just restricting our attention to knowledge claims about the perceptual environment that we occupy is actually too limited and can be misleading as to what the real problem of knowledge is. And that's something that I've written about in that Frontiers of Knowledge book and am working on now.
Do you think there's any difference between the challenges posed by skeptical scenarios such as Descartes' evil demon argument compared to the modern simulation hypothesis that people talk about? Or do you think it's just the same thing over again?
They can be different or the same depending upon the approach that you take. Because if you take the Cartesian approach, namely that the skeptical considerations are heuristics, because they help us to identify what the task is that we need to do in epistemology, what the problem is that we need to solve. Or correlatively, if you take the view that the skeptical challenges illustrate for us what kind of methodological challenges we have to overcome in our knowledge pursuits, then you can see that actually skepticism is very, very helpful. If you treat it as methodological rather than as problematic, so people who treat skepticism as a serious problem, who think maybe that it establishes a kind of agneology, that we really don't know things in certain domains, or that we are not going to be able to find out things in certain domains, then that very kind of pessimistic and unhelpful approach, I think, is the wrong way to think of skepticism.
And this book, The Frontiers of Knowledge, that I mentioned in the introduction, is all about knowledge and its progress and aspects of this sort. So can you please present to people that haven't read the book, what do you think are the interesting epistemological advancements and problems of our time?
Well, okay, so it occurred to me in thinking about developments in the history of recent science, and in the history of archaeology and ancient history, and also in even more recent developments in thinking about the sciences of the brain and the mind, that they're all of them very, very recent, and they've all made enormous progress, huge strides. I mean, if you consider that, the electron was identified by, only in 1897 or something, and that everything that's followed from that, Planck and Einstein and quantum theory in the 1920s and the Standard Model in the 1970s, now completed by the Higgs boson, and all the current speculation about whether there's, what further science there is beyond the Standard Model. This is all just in the last century or so. It's only also since the second half of the 19th century, first half 20th century, that we've really discovered that history goes back further than 1000 BC, because until that point, Herodotus and the Old Testament were about it, weren't they? But the discovery of the Mesopotamian civilizations very much depended upon archaeology. And finally, functional magnetic resonance imaging is such a recent technology. So looking at brain activity in real time and correlating that with psychological attributes, this is all happening right now and very, very recent. And yet, this huge expansion of knowledge has told us how little we know, because we now know that we have access to less than 5% of the mass density of the universe. We interact with less than 5% of the universe. And so this big increase in knowledge has hugely expanded our ignorance. And the same is true of history, because now that we've discovered entire civilizations with literatures and writing and codes of law and what have you, that we didn't know existed at all until 100 years ago, we now speculate on what else we don't know. What about civilizations that didn't leave any durable remains? Civilizations that were based on just on wood, let's say, or anything perishable. Anyway, so this raises really serious questions, and it makes us ask ourselves the question, so what do we need to be very careful about in our methodologies of research? And in that book, I start in the opening section by talking about a series of challenges to inquiry that we need to overcome or be mindful of as we inquire. And some of them are very familiar. The hammer problem. If your tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The lamplight problem, the only place you can look is under the lamp because everywhere else is too dark, etc., etc. So these are very familiar problems, but they tell us something. Think, for example, about human evolution. The whole theory of human evolution is based on a few bones found in just a few places. And so the tiny, sort of 0.00 something percent of the Earth's surface that has been dug up looking for human bones or fossil remains is tiny. So we're speculating on the basis of very, very small data sets. And yet, and we have to be conscious of the fact that all our theorizing predicated on it is going to be vulnerable to these sorts of challenges. But the challenges are healthy, because I list 12 challenges there, which I say anybody in any of the sciences or the humanities or anybody doing any kind of research needs to be very mindful of this. And that is a wonderful lesson. They are the challenges that the skeptic poses, and those challenges teach us, therefore, how to inquire.
But it seems that in order to make very novel epistemic advances, starting with this year onwards, you need people that have knowledge of a wide array of domains. So it seems that they require a sort of interdisciplinary team of thinkers that are able to advance our knowledge. I mean, even in narrow fields like physics, it seems like that some papers require thousands of authors on a single subject, because not anyone can just do the physics required to publish that paper. But when you combine sciences together, it seems like this interdisciplinarity might turn out to be a problem, because you mentioned towards the end of the book that universities tend to train narrow specialists in one subject. So I guess this also can go into different directions, but what would be your thoughts on modern academia and the relationship between a generalist education versus a specialist education, and how do you see that in a grander epistemological project of advancing knowledge?
Well, look, I think it is necessary to have a specialism, to be a specialist, and to have deep knowledge about a very focused area, providing that specialism is embedded in a more general, a broader context, that you are aware of both of neighboring fields and of even, distant fields as well, because the cross-fertilization of ideas across disciplines is very helpful, and more than helpful, it is, as you've just pointed out, necessary in some cases. Interdisciplinarity is great and vital. It's essential. I can't get away from it. But the interdisciplinarity in question, both within an individual inquirer and within a team of inquirers, requires a degree of specialism. And the interesting thing about specialism is that when you focus down on a very, very, very particular problem, it's a bit like focusing a laser beam onto something, and then it heats up the whole surrounding area or lights it up. And you find yourself understanding a field because you've really acquired some understanding of a particular thing in that field. And that's a very healthy byblow of this process. But you're right, I mean, interdisciplinarity is very important. And therefore, when we encourage people in education, we should try to advise them not to over-specialize at the expense of understanding what's nearby in their field and what could be useful to them from outside.
Right. So what would you advise, for instance, a high school student that wants to go to university? How should he or she model their education in order to be a modern citizen in this century and also be able to find intellectual joy in what they're doing. So what would you tell a high school student that wants to go into higher education?
Well, I would, well, firstly, let me just premise the reply by saying that there are two models, not very different from one another in some ways, which I think we're in danger of losing sight of in higher education. One of them is the sort of American model, the liberal arts, undergraduate degree, and then specialization at the graduate level. So you do a general degree, and then you go into whatever it might be, law, medicine, or philosophy or something, and you specialize in that field. And if people really saw the point of that and were prepared for, what turns out to be a long haul, because it's going to be, in the American system, that'll be about, 7-8 years of higher education. But if people accepted that and saw the point of it, I think it would be a very good thing. There are lots of people whose enthusiasms mean that they want to get on with it right from the very beginning and specialize early, which it's not impossible to do in the liberal arts model, because you can navigate a route through where you specialize on a major and you get as much from doing that major as you can. A lot of people think that the minor subjects or the required subjects, ancillary subjects, you just have to do them. They're requirements and they're a bit of a bore. And that's the wrong attitude to them, because, again, speaking to your point about interdisciplinarity, to have a real appreciation and to take an interest in those other fields, in the end, proves tremendously important. The second model is the German one. I think things are changing in German higher education as well, but it was the case that you went to university with no idea what you might do or not do, and just take a whole lot of courses, and time went by, you spent years and years there, and out of the sort of great cloud of things that you found yourself being interested in and doing, came the thing that you wanted to focus on, do your doctorate and your habilitation on, and become a scholar in. But that would emerge out of what is a very general sort of roaming education. Now, there will be people who are critical of that, who say that if you really are going to master a field, you have to get into it deep and early and become a great specialist in it. And I can see the force of that argument. But to answer your question, I would say to somebody now, so supposing you're passionate about something, physics or computing or philosophy or history, whatever it might be, yeah, chase your passion. I mean, absolutely go for it. But see if you can do it in a situation where you also do something else. So, on the kind of Oxford model, or the model where you do a major with a minor subject, or, have an opportunity to do something else. Because if you, for example, if you did a degree in philosophy with computing, there are two different intellectual disciplines there, as you yourself know.
Yeah.
And you find that sometimes you can export the discipline from one field into the other field in ways that are very useful and revealing. And you sometimes find that things that you discover or learn in one field show you that things being discussed in the other field are incredibly trivial and missing the point. So you can learn a lot by the import-export experience of crossing disciplinary boundaries.
Do you think that in the UK, so for instance, in Romania, with the country that I am from, a lot of people tend to believe that if you're good at the arts, you can't be good at the sciences. So for instance, someone that does, languages has the wild card to just pop out, I don't do mathematics because I'm good at languages. Or someone who does mathematics, well, I don't need to read because I'm good at STEM subjects. And to me, that seems extremely wrong. And I was wondering whether you feel that in the UK, for instance, there is this tendency of people that are in either arts or sciences to have a license not to be interested in the other field.
Yes, I agree with you, absolutely. I'm afraid there is that same thing here. And in fact, it used to be actively fostered, because at school, very early, around about the age of 14, people were streamed either onto the arts side or onto the science side. And for a very, very long time, I mean, right up into my own school days, the people who went into the arts side regarded themselves as being rather aristocratic and superior to the people who went and did sort of smelly subjects like chemistry, where you got your fingernails dirty and all that, so the sciences were regarded as, for, sort of technician types, whereas the aristocratic types were going to be doing history and art and what have you. That's a terrible kind of attitude, and a really great pity, because of course, taught in the right way and encouraged in the right way, especially if you're able to find ways to reach a person's interests and capacities. There are very, very few people who absolutely cannot do mathematics, and very, very few people who absolutely cannot enjoy literature and poetry if they're invited into those pursuits in the right kind of way and encouraged in the right kind of way. I mean, I, for example, was, so I went to a school where I was channeled off into the, doing Latin and history and all those things, and stopped doing, we only had to do, maths up until the sort of GCSE level, and we had to do one science. So of course, all the people who went on the arts side all did biology because they thought that that was a kind of soft, science. And all the people who did physics and chemistry and mathematics and biology had to do English for GCSE, and they all complained about it like mad because they had to write an essay or read a play. And that seems to me to be a terrible, terrible waste of human potential. So I agree with you on this one.
Yeah. Coming back to the themes of the book, it seems to me that your model of fruitful intellectual inquiry doesn't concern itself too much with certainty or truth, or at least absolute truth, if there's a difference in your opinion. Can you please elaborate on this in case I get it right?
No, you have got it right. And for me, this is a really, really important point, because in one very, very good sense of the term knowledge, nobody knows anything. And I'm not saying that as a paid up agnologist or skeptic, who denies that we have what in the colloquial sense of knowledge, we have plenty of, the kind of stuff which is encyclopedias and textbooks and so forth. But if you think about, I mean, just go down to the most simplistic account of the nature of knowledge, justified true belief, okay? So we have a problem with truth, you know about that, you know plenty about that, okay? We have a problem, we don't have much of a problem about belief because everybody believes lots of false things all the time, so it's easy to believe even falsehoods. But justification, well, the whole issue of justification is correlative to the issue of skepticism, or challenges to inquiry and the methods of inquiry, the stuff we were talking about earlier. So if you got hold of a physicist or a chemist or a virologist or something and said, do you feel under this very strict definition of knowledge that it is true and completely exhaustively justified belief? Do you know anything? Well, a self-respecting scientist should say no. But I have very, very, very powerfully supported theories, a lot of empirical data, a lot of evidence. It's passed very rigorous tests to try and falsify it. I could give it sigma 5. That's a very high level of confidence. It's extremely unlikely that this is just error or experimental variability or something. But so what's being said there is this, that the question is not a question about what you know and don't know. Instead, the question is about what it is rational to believe, what it is rational to premise in your further reasoning and in your actions. And this is key, because let us take the kind of standard case here, which is you cannot know that there is not a God. You cannot prove that there is not a God. That kind of argument? Yeah. Well, that is not the right way to frame the problem, because the right way to frame the problem is to say, is it rational to believe that there are gods and goddesses on Olympus, or that there are fairies at the bottom of the garden, and so on. And when you think of the probative value of the evidence that you have for and against these claims, you see what it's rational to believe. And that word rational, it's very interesting. First part of that word, ratio, means the proportion between your evidence, the judgments you make, the premises you commit yourself to, the actions that you perform. So for me, the real question in epistemology is not what is known, given the tremendous difficulty of securing truth or absolute truth, if they are different. I don't think they are, but securing truth. And instead, we should be thinking of the degrees of rationality that we can attach to the things we say and think.
I see. So in a nutshell, you adopt a broadly Humean spirit in that you proportion your beliefs to the evidence, and you reject traditional epistemology.
Yes.
Or more of a Bayesian
Yeah.
in that spirit. Okay.
I think, by the way, your interest, which is in formal conceptions of truth, you see, again, so I take the view, and perhaps you remember if you made use of that philosophical logic book, I take the view that the predicate expression is true, is in fact a kind of dummy. And it's a dummy for much more precise expressions in different domains of discourse. So, so is true, perhaps in the ordinary empirical perceptual domain, might be something like is verified or is justified, I don't know. Or in the moral case, it might be is to be recommended or universalized. And in the mathematical case, might be is provable. Now, look, I know all three of those suggestions are very, very contentious, obviously, but I just use them as examples of what might be popped into the dummy place. So, because if you think about what you mean when you talk about truth in the moral case, the perceptual case, the mathematical case, it's obvious that you're talking about different things, and there are different standards of proof and different standards of evidence and different kinds of evidence. And so it cannot be a univocal concept. And most people who think of truth, outside formal languages anyway, think that it is univocal. And because it's very unsatisfactory to think if it were a substantive concept, it was a real property of truth bearers in some way, and yet it seems to have all these different conditions of applicability. Let's deal with the problem by minimalizing it. So you just have a very minimalist view of the nature of truth. And that seems to me wrong too, because if I say to you, okay, Theodore, I've put £1 million in your bank account. And you say, is that true? And I say, well, what does it add to say it's true? But you would say it makes a big difference, because if it's true, I'm a millionaire. And if it's not true, then I'm not, so it makes a big difference.
I actually think you're right that moral truth and mathematical truth and scientific truth might diverge. So I guess this is a bit of detour, but are you a traditional epistemologist with respect to mathematics?
Well, what would it be to be one? Because before you can decide on that question, you've got to decide just how Platonist you're going to be about mathematics, or just how constructivist you're going to be, and so on. So in fact, it's a good question, Theodore, because the metaphysics that you're bringing to bear about mathematical entities. I mean, are there sets? Are there functions? I mean, do these things exist independently of doing maths, of having a bank overdraft, and so on? I mean, that's the question which has to be decided before, or in tandem with questions about how you would make epistemic claims about these things.
I see. And I guess that also helps us get into the religious realm in a moment, because again, like in mathematics, you can't proportion your belief to the evidence really, because there's no real evidence that you might encounter in order. Well, there might be some evidence once a new result pops up, which sort of makes plausible another result to be true. But the evidence for a mathematician is not like evidence for a physicist. So knowledge in mathematical case might be a bit different, because mathematical statements are not scientific hypotheses that need to be corroborated by new data and things of this sort. And I'm wondering whether in the religious case, again, you might deal with a non-scientific hypothesis whereby you can't really bear the evidence that you get in a lab or from polls or from data. Do you think that on your model of knowledge, you can make epistemological progress in theology?
Okay, so let's just go back over that bit of terrain now, all right?
Yeah, okay.
Because again, so just to put the matter rather crudely, suppose your option in the mathematical case is between treating mathematics as discovery, so you just literally take the cover of something and find a new mathematical truth, that's discovery, okay? Or that you're constructing, you've got a kind of constructivist approach and you're making up mathematics as you go. Now, on that second line, you could call in aid such ideas as certain sorts of concepts, certain definitions, the axioms you use, the rules of inference that you accept, and so on, will determine the kind of results that you get. Change the number base and you get different looking arithmetic equations and so on. Whereas if it's discovery, if there really are objectively existing things like sets and functions out there in some Platonic universe or other, then it's not up to you, and the mathematical truth, if there were such a thing, would not be the result of how you decide to define and which axioms you choose to predicate, okay?
Yeah.
So there is, in that case, there is a parallel. I mean, it would be wrong to talk of evidence in mathematics in the way that you talk of evidence in science, yes, but something would count as the probative basis for a claim that you make in mathematics, which does the work of evidence. You know, what is it that's going to convince you that there is such a thing, as some result? It will be whether or not the proof works, or whether or not the mathematical mechanics that you're employing to try to derive the result are themselves, whether they themselves stand up to scrutiny. So you could think of some kind of analogy there of something that counts as evidence or support for a mathematical claim. That's why I think that it's wrong to think that the religious case is like the mathematical case where there isn't scientific type evidence available for maths, okay? Because, do you remember Carl Sagan's example of the dragon in the garage?
Actually, I don't remember that one. What is it?
Okay, I'll tell you what it is in a minute because it's a good one. But just before we do, we have to remind ourselves that the concept of proof in formal contexts, maths and logic, is very different from the concept of proof in the contingent case, in the empirical case.
Yeah.
So in the formal case, a conclusion in the deductive inference is in fact a petitio principii, because all the information in the conclusion is already in the premises, and the conclusion is just a rearrangement of the premises. So that's familiar, so a proof of a syllogism or something would look like that. But in the empirical or contingent case, proof means test. You go to a steel factory and you see when they're casting rods or sheets of steel, every 100th or 1000th rod, they take it, and when it's cooled down, they prove it. That is, they load it to see how much loading it will take before it snaps. This is called proving the steel, testing it. We have a saying in English, you may know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. That means the test of the pudding is in the eating. We talk about the exception that proves the rule. Now, of course, most people can get that wrong because they think if there's an exception to the rule's okay, it's been proved, right? What this means is the exception that tests how far the rule applies and when the rule stops applying, okay? So proof means test. And this is where Sagan's dragon comes into the picture. Your friend says to you, I've got a dragon in my garage. You say, oh, great, I'd love to see a dragon. He says, well, this dragon is invisible. So you say, okay, but we can hear it flapping its wings, can't we? Nah, this dragon is silent. Oh, can we put talcum powder on the floor of the garage and see its footprints? Nah, this dragon never lands on the floor. Okay, what about its hot, fiery breath? Nah, this dragon doesn't have hot, fiery breath, etc., okay? You have proved that there is no dragon in the garage because you've tested, you've looked at anything, whatever that would count as evidence to support his claim that he's got a dragon in the garage, and nothing comes up, nothing works out. And in that sense, there is insufficient evidence for the existence of gods and goddesses and fairies and other supernatural entities to support the claim that there are such things, which claims themselves cannot be alternatively explained by psychology or history or tradition or the desire of the person to believe.
So under your model, theology can't make epistemological progress, right? Because the prior, which we feed into the Bayesian updating process, is close to close to zero, and it's very hard to understand what evidence could raise that number. So if I'm right and your model discounts theology as being epistemologically fruitful, what would be your explanation for the fact that most people on the planet take religion as a sort of certain truth?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of historical and psychological reasons why that's so. But I mean, do put religious belief into the context of the fact that there were many other religions and many other gods and supernatural beings and so on no longer believed in, and once passionately believed in. And things like astrology and numerology and, you know, all those things which are now minority interests. Of course, there are still people who think astrologically and numerologically, but it's a mixture of social reinforcement of religion, you know, because it's in the interests of society to try to persuade people that there's an invisible policeman who's going to reward them or punish them depending upon how they behave. The fact that people grasp at consolations, they're afraid of death or illness, or they're frightened when they're in the trenches in war. You know, there were all sorts of explanations that you can give as to why people believe what they do. And, you know, people are very, very good at compartmentalizing and being rational about paying their taxes and, you know, finding the right train to get from Bristol to London and so forth. But they can be very irrational at the same time, you know, because we're kind of modularized in our epistemics here. And the desire to believe, the need for comfort, the fact that you were brought up in a religious tradition, remembering that the vast majority of people have the religion that their parents did. And that tells you a great deal about why a religion continues to exist.
I mean, some people would just say that you can't discount a belief based on the origin of that belief, because if the belief is true, the locals will obviously adhere to that belief. I think it's called the genetic fallacy.
I don't believe in the genetic fallacy, by the way. I think that's a serious mistake, because I think sometimes understanding the origin and evolution of a concept or a whole conceptual framework is extremely educative, very, very revealing. And so I always push back when people produce the genetic fallacy here. And in the case of religion, but what's so interesting is this: if you look just at the history of a given religion, like Christianity, let's say, and what it was that people believed and no longer believe, and what practices people engaged in and which they no longer engage in, it shows you that the core beliefs of religion can mutate, they can evolve in response to discoveries, like, for example, the fact that the planet Earth is not at the center of the universe and we're not exceptional. And the discoveries in astronomy and astrophysics and in biology and evolutionary theory are all of them profoundly challenging to what were firmly held religious beliefs about the nature of the universe and its origins and our existence in it and our purpose in it. But here's an interesting thing. It seems to me that the origins of religion lie in their being proto-science, because our very earliest ancestors had exactly one conceptual resource to help them try to understand natural phenomena, and that is their own experience as agents. So agency, making something happen, changing a series of events in the world, throwing a stone into the water and making a splash. So there must be an agent behind the wind and the sun and the thunder and all that. It's to be a natural thing to think, projectivist sort of theory. And at some point, people must have thought that there were encounters with these agents in a fever, in a nightmare, in a dream, when you've eaten something you didn't realize it had fermented and you're drunk and you think you've met the gods. So those kinds of experiences must have led people to think that there was an interface between the realm of these agencies and our own realm. Although, of course, to begin with, as is evident still in animism, but in all mythologies, these agents were in nature. They weren't supernatural. The dryads and the nymphs were in the trees and the streams, and the gods were on the mountains and what have you. But interestingly, over time, the huge number of supernatural beings who operated nature became fewer and fewer. And they went up from the woods and the streams to the mountaintops, which were the holy places. That's where the Olympian gods lived, where Moses met his God in a burning bush, okay? And then when people got to the top of the mountains and there were no gods there, the gods, reducing even further in number, were now in the sky, you know? And now they're outside space and time altogether, because nowadays we know that the sky isn't up, it's everywhere. so even that metaphor has now gone. So if you look at it historically, you see how religion alters itself, it alters its metaphysics and its epistemology over time to accommodate itself to new knowledge, new understanding of the world, but to continue to feed these psychological needs that people have.
I think your friend and colleague Daniel Dennett, in his book Breaking the Spell, investigated religion as a natural phenomenon in a way historically and via cultural evolutionary tools and psychology and the like. And speaking of him, if someone reads your Wikipedia page, they would see that you belong to the school of thought New Atheism alongside Dennett, Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris. What do you think of that label? And what is new about the New Atheism, and how do you understand atheism more generally?
Okay, so there's nothing new about it, but I'm very happy to be, be there with Richard and Dan and Sam Harris and Stephen Pinker and so on. And they're all friends of mine, and I'm very happy to be, find myself in agreement with them. So that's okay. So by atheism, so okay. I distinguish between three important isms: atheism, secularism, humanism. So for me, atheism, the dispute between atheists and theists is a metaphysical dispute. It's about what exists or doesn't exist in or in association with the universe in some way. And of course, the word atheist is a theist's word. You know, it's a bit like, I sometimes use the example of not collecting stamps. So I don't collect stamps. And in just the same way as I don't collect stamps, I don't think there are supernatural agencies in the universe. So these other people who do collect stamps, they call me an stamp collector or an atheist, okay? It's their label, and it's not a belief. It's impossible to be a militant atheist any more than it's possible to be a militant non-stamp collector. Okay, so it's just the same, the parallel works there. But you can be a militant secularist. You know, Christopher Hitchens used to say that he wasn't only an atheist, he was an anti-theist. But to be an anti-theist was to be a militant secularist and wanting people to stop trying to impose their religious beliefs and practices on us, like don't have abortions and so on, okay? So a familiar contemporary example. So the atheism theism debate is a metaphysical debate. The secularism debate is about how much amplification, how much influence the religious voice should be given in the public square on public policy matters in government. And familiarly, secularism says, let's keep what people choose to believe, their personal private beliefs and all that, out of the service to the whole community, to everybody, which is what government ought to provide. So that's familiar enough. And there are plenty of religious people who are also secularists, because they share that view. And in fact, the origins of secularism in Europe come from the church wanting the temporal powers to keep out of their church business. Of course, the church didn't want to keep out of the temporal powers business, so it was a very asymmetrical desire they had. But they wanted a separation of church and state so the state wouldn't over-influence them. And the final thing, which is the one that really interests me most, is humanism, which is a non-religious ethical outlook predicated on our best, most sympathetic, most generous understanding of human nature, of the human condition, of thinking about how we should treat one another. And but at the same time, of course, one's got to be very strict about the lines that one draws in the sand, because the great problem with being a small L liberal or a humanist or a nice guy is that you tolerate the intolerant, and then you get into trouble. So you have to have standards, and the standards have to be fairly exigent. But at the same time, to try to recognize the diversity of interests, needs, personalities, characters ways of life, choices that people make, is a way of respecting one's fellows and trying to build a good, the good community, on that basis.
And I guess those three distinctions that you mentioned can be turned on and off in a single person. So you might have a theist that is a secularist, and you might have all combinations of ones and zeros in a single person. So if someone tells me that he's an atheist, I can't conclude whether he's a secularist or well,
you'd be on reasonably safe ground if you did draw those inferences. Okay, and I should think actually, given the contemporary meaning of the word humanism, so in the Renaissance period, there were plenty of religious humanists, like Erasmus and people like that. But today, it distinctively means somebody whose ethical outlook has no religious connotations or premises. So if somebody is an atheist, it's very likely to be a humanist in ethics. And the one which is different, the one which you can switch on and off, is the secularism thing, because almost all atheists are secularists, but some religious people are also secularists.
And I think I heard you say once that religious people, if they are rational, should be secularists, because otherwise, if an opposing religion gets power, that threatens their own religion. So out of pure rationality, you might want to be a secularist as a religious person.
And yes, absolutely. And not just rationality, also self-interest.
Self-interest again, too. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about the first dispute, the metaphysical one. I will try for a bit to play God's advocate, and because I just taught a group of my students Descartes, and I wanted to ask, what do you think of the standard armchair arguments for the existence of God? For instance, the ontological argument. I mean, through pure conceptual analysis, when you think about what properties God might have, you realize that he must possess all perfections, which are the special positive properties in a way. And existence seems to be one of them. So why can't you just conclude by pure conceptual analysis that the God concept must be instantiated?
Look, all the traditional arguments for God's existence are really terrible arguments. So this one, the ontological argument, is no better than any of the others. And there are various reasons for it. You will know that Kant already pointed out that existence is not a property of anything. It's a presupposition of anything bearing properties in the first place. So immediately, if that's correct, then immediately the argument fails, because if you can't ascribe existence among the other perfections that this being is supposed to have, then you can't say that it follows from the very definition of this being that the being exists. But you can also effect a reductio of the argument too, because by the same argument, you can prove that a devil, Satan, cannot exist.
How?
Think of it. There is a being who is the least perfect being in the universe. A least perfect being who doesn't exist is less perfect than one that does exist, okay? So the least perfect being cannot exist. So, I mean, that's an absurdity, right? It's an absurdity, especially because this, you might be the most perfect being in the universe, Theodore. Just think of it. Somebody is the tallest person in Bristol today. If there are two people who are equally tall, then the one that got up latest is tallest because gravity hasn't shortened him yet, okay? I mean, just as a matter of logic, somebody must be the most something or other. So somebody in our world must be the most perfect person in the world, or the nearest thing to perfection in our world. But that person could still be very, very, very imperfect.
But about the devil rejoinder, the theistic proposition doesn't appeal to the devil, right? The theistic proposition just posits an omniperfect God. So the fact that you eliminate the possibility of the devil existing does not affect the argument towards the God of the philosophers, right?
Well, the bad news for the ontological argument is that the ontological argument doesn't turn on appeal to God or anything else. It appeals to logic. And the Satan rejoinder is an appeal to the logic of the argument.
What about necessary existence? Do you think that Kantian reply applies to that as well? Because, yeah, existence might not be a property like being red. It's a second order property in a way. But what about necessary existence? When you believe that God is a maximally great being and you realize that contingent existence is not enough, and necessary existence is the thing that we're interested in. And both parties in the debate realize that it's possible that both them and the other might be wrong. You have this model version of the ontological argument whereby the mere possibility of this entity existing guarantees via model logic that it actually exists. What do you think of that version of the argument?
I find that very, very, I find the concept of anything being necessary, simpliciter, completely unconvincing. I think all necessities are relative necessities or conditional necessities. They always have to be couched in a conditional. You know, I mean, in the Kantian case, what is necessary for the possibility of experience is conditionally necessary for the possibility of experience. If there is experience, then there has to be something like a belief in causality or number and quantity and quality and blah, blah, blah. But if there isn't existence, then those things don't exist because they're only required for the thing that we are talking about. So, but the idea of something being absolutely necessary, so let's use the terminology of possible worlds and say, if there's a necessary being, this being exists in every possible world. That's what we mean by using the strong modality, it has to exist. And then consider to yourself, is it possible that there is no possible world in which something has to exist in that world? And if that is possible, then there is no such thing as a necessary being, because a necessary being would have to be in every possible world. If it's possible that one possible world doesn't have a necessary being in it, then there's no necessary being.
Yeah, I agree. So you don't believe that mathematical objects exist necessarily without conditional qualifications?
Well, my own view is, and again, this is sort of, the problem here is that, so mathematical objects, okay, well, we've already got ourselves into difficulty. Mathematical entities, sets, functions, okay, things like that. In what sense do they exist? So this takes us back to this problem about how we articulate the idea of quantifying over them. What are we doing when we quantify over them? We have to make some kind of sense of them. We've got to be able to say what I mean by a set, what I mean by a function, give a definition, and then to manipulate them or to work with them or pop them into equations and things. There has to be a pretty clear definition of what they are, which, by the way, seems to me to favor the sort of constructivist line that we have on these things. Because if I were to, well, I mean, in fact, we do this, don't we? Because we have a number of different set theories, don't we? You know, we have Zumeta, Frankel, and whatever. And so we can change axioms and change rules, and we get different outcomes. So it just seems to me that the pressure is very, very emphatically in the direction of constructivism, which means that we're not and shouldn't really be talking about mathematical entities as objective, as somehow independent of what we do with them. And if that's right, then again, we're not talking about things that are necessary.
My last podcast episode was with William Lane Craig, and I talked to him like half an hour about the cosmological argument. What do you think is a problem with the cosmological argument? It's obviously logically valid, so that's not up for debate. And presumably you also grant that the universe had a beginning 13.8 billion years ago. So you also accept his second premise that the universe began to exist. He has the other premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause for its existence. He concludes that the universe has a cause for its existence. And then he reflects on the nature of this cause and calls it God in the end. What do you think is the appropriate response to a cosmological type argument?
Well, of course, the short response to say is if the reasoning that everything has to have a cause and then there must be a first cause, and then you ask the question, well, what is that first cause? What's your motivation for saying that it isn't a flea or a gnome or a pine leaf or anything arbitrary?
Because that's the answer. Universe.
Well, no, but the answer, it comes actually from theological tradition, from traditional religion. So you choose to think there must be a God who is the first cause, because that's the readiest, comes from the tradition of, you know, creationist myths and what have you. But it's completely arbitrary, because you could just say, well, the first cause, if there has to be a first cause, it's a, and then you can pluck anything out of the air, it's a pencil, or it's a piece of chewing gum, or, you know, it's about as arbitrary as that. But long before you get to that kind of facile, sort of flippant answer, you have to ask yourself a couple of other questions. If the universe has a cause, why can't it be its own cause? Which is precisely what Big Bang cosmology suggests it is. You know, the universe is its own cause. The laws of physics, although admittedly the Big Bang is a singularity, so the laws of physics as we now know and love them didn't apply at that point. But something would have applied at that point that physically explains the occurrence of the Big Bang and, you know, early inflationary universe and so forth. But even more to the point than that, in that book, The Frontiers of Knowledge, I point out that we are trying to understand the universe using these extremely finite and limited resources, conceptual resources that we have, that are formulated for us at our scale in the universe. The dimensions that we occupy spatially and temporally in the universe is a very, very, very narrow little band in the total scale of the universe. Think all the way from the Planck dimensions at the smallest that we currently know, all the way to the diameter of the universe itself. And maybe those two limits are themselves very arbitrary, artificial, just because we can't think bigger or smaller than those two limits, okay? And we're looking at this universe through what I call the pinhole, this little tiny little point at our scale. And we use concepts which are appropriate to that scale. Now, one of the concepts that we use at our scale is the concept of causation. And we seem to think inescapably that everything that happens has to happen because it's caused. But that doesn't work at the quantum level of explanation. You know, we can't reinterpret the operation and the reversal and the arrow of time and so on at the quantum level in classical terms. We can't bring that back into our level of experience and understand it. Here is exactly the reason why the classical and quantum levels don't mutually compute. So maybe the concept of causality that we occupy for our convenience at our scale doesn't really apply to the universe. And if it doesn't, then the cosmological argument immediately falls.
And the last question, since I promised.
Oh, by the way, sorry Theodore, to interrupt you, but so also, if what I've just been saying about causality is right, so also do the dilemmas about free will.
Can you elaborate a bit?
Well, because, you know, again, to just put it crudely, the free will problem is that if we are natural entities in the natural world and everything that happens in the natural world happens causally, then everything we do is causally determined. But at the same time, we predicate genuine ability to choose freely and to do things differently in order to make sense of our morality and praise and blame and responsibility in ourselves as social beings. And so here's the conflict in the free will debate. And one way to get over the conflict in the free will debate is to say, well, maybe the concept of causality that we work with. You see, again, in that book, I argue that we are very paraconsistent in our thinking about the world. We use concepts of time, of space, of causality in all sorts of different ways that are not compatible with one another. But I use this concept for that reason, purpose, and this concept for that purpose, and they work perfectly well for those purposes because they're convenient. But they are in conflict with one another. Our human conceptual scheme was full of anomalies and contradictions. And this is one of them. I mean, the free will debate is a perfect example of how contradictorily we think about things. Think about the world as a causal realm. We think of ourselves as free agents, and the two just don't match up.
If I had more time, I would press you on free will because I think that's a fascinating topic. The last thing that I had in mind was about morality more generally, because also William Lane Craig invokes God as an explanation for the fact that there are objective moral facts. He doesn't say that someone like you would say that, I know, murder is not wrong. He grants that, but he would say that he can't be objectively wrong under any secularist type of morality. And the mere fact that there exists such objective moral facts can only be true under a theistic framework. What would you say to that?
Well, I presume, I mean, there are plenty of things I would say to it, but one of the ones that always annoys me about that kind of argument is that if it is consistent with what you quote Lane Craig as saying, is that if God said that murder is good, it would follow that it is. And that would chime very, poorly with the reasons why, independently of divine commands about how we should behave and treat other people, why we would think murder is bad. And here are the reasons. Because it seems to me, by the way, that there are objective grounds for morality, implicit in natural facts about human beings and human experience. Now, what you're just about to hear, therefore, is somebody who disagrees with Hume's claim that you cannot derive prescriptions from descriptions. Okay, so you can't get from an is to an ought. I think you can, because I think we know about the vast majority of human beings that they do not like to be cold, hungry, in pain, locked up, deprived of opportunities, oppressed, tortured. We know these things about most human beings. Those human beings who do like those sorts of things are weird. All right. So we have a repertoire of very fundamental facts about human experience, what makes for human flourishing, and what causes human beings suffering. And those facts about human beings should tell us something about how we should treat them, because they certainly tell us something about how we want to be treated. So you could, even the cheapest kind of most basic sort of self-interest argument, self-referential argument would say, if you don't like these things yourself, what possible justification could you give for doing them to other people? Then that would be a familiar move. But I think most people are sensitive enough, and I think we are evolved to be to some degree considerate about other people, or at very least to understand how things are with other people. I use the example when I'm talking to students about this. I give the example of that. Did you see that thing on YouTube a couple of years ago about a basketball player in America? He was hit on the head by a basketball and his eye popped out. Did you see that?
I think I've seen something, but not with a basketball player, but with other sports.
Yeah, okay. Right. So there's this thing about this guy's eye popping out, okay? And there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of YouTube videos, not of this eye popping out, but of people seeing the eye popping out. And you look at the reaction of people to seeing this thing happening. Everybody goes like that. They're horrified by the thought of it. They're squeamish, And at least part of the reason why they're squeamish is because they are feeling instinctively something about what it's like to be him. And that capacity, even though we're also capable of cruelty and unkindness and of dismissing other people's interests and needs and so forth, but that capacity sympathetically to register how things are with others and why they might not be liking it and why they might be liking it and so on, feeds into our ability to judge how to respond to people and how to behave to them. And that to me is at least part, admittedly jointly with certain other considerations, for basing an ethical, moral outlook.
But don't you think that what you just said is a fact of evolutionary moral psychology, which is shared by us and explains why we might be kind towards each other and have these instincts of not do to others what we wouldn't like to be done to us and so forth? But I guess a theist would say that the key part in their argument is the objectivity thing. So you might explain how we synchronize each other in our desires and care for our closest circle, and how we might get that to a society level where we might have reasons for flourishing by behaving certain ways. But is that objective? What's the metaphysical status of the morality that you described?
Well, I mean, I'm very happy to regard evolutionary outcomes as being pretty objective, and also a pretty good basis for explaining certain considerations about how people do behave towards one another and why they do, And the transition from why they do it to you should do it, so from the descriptive to prescriptive move, lies in the explanation you would give in the descriptive move to why this is advantageous to those others or to society in general, or why it would be advantageous to you if you were a beneficiary of them. And so the prescriptive move to should. So this is how, people have this capacity, people do these things, people have these needs, people have these experiences. Therefore, you should behave on the basis of this knowledge. Seems to me no different from prudential prescriptions. So here are the facts. If you go into a crowded room without a mask on and you haven't been vaccinated, then you're going to get COVID. So maybe you should get a vaccination or you should wear a mask. Now that's a prudential should. But the logic of the moral should and the prudential should seems to me to be the same. And every bit is good.
Professor Grayling, thank you for taking the time to be here with me today. I mean, I think I really learned a lot, and I hope you enjoyed it too.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your invitation. It was a great pleasure to meet you and to be on your podcast. And good luck with your work. Hope it goes well.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye.